April 2026. A man is banned from driving for 6 months after being caught speeding twice on a public road. Nothing unusual about that, except this man is 44 years old, and this is not the first time speed nearly ended him. Back in 2010, that same instinct put him inside a fireball at over 160 miles an hour on a public road turned racetrack in front of thousands of people. He walked away, and he kept racing. His name is Guy Martin. For nearly 2 decades, on the Isle of Man TT, the most dangerous racetrack in the world, he stood on the podium 17 times, and never once won. Team bosses called him impossible to control. The public called him a legend. Team bosses, race officials, even the law itself, none of them could ever make this man slow down. This is the story of why. At 16 years old, while his mates were saving up for driving lessons, Guy Martin spent every last penny on motorbikes instead. At 44, he has never once voted in a general election. Not one single time in his life. To keep working and racing at the same time, when he was young and broke, he leaned on ephedrine, caffeine, and aspirin, just to keep his body going. And more recently, he built a motorbike powered by a 1,200 horsepower turbine engine, the same kind used inside a Rolls-Royce Westland Lynx military helicopter. His target? Break 400 miles an hour on land on 2 wheels. The current record stands at 376.363 miles an hour. None of that made him a champion. All of it made him something else entirely. There is one reason behind it. In 2018, Guy Martin was diagnosed with Asperger syndrome. It did not change how people saw him. It explained him. And that same inability to do anything halfway was about to cost him his first job in professional racing. Back in the early 2000s, a team boss named Sam Finley saw something special in a young Guy Martin and signed him to ride for his Suzuki team. Martin was fast. Faster than fast. That was the problem. At the Ulster Grand Prix in 2003, Martin threw out the race plan the team had agreed on. During practice, he pushed the bike far beyond what anyone had signed off on. Marshals on the course complained. It was too dangerous, even by road racing standards. His team told him to back off. He didn't. Instead, he went out and won, by a distance nobody else on the grid could touch. For most bosses, that would have been a good day. For Sam Finley, it was the final straw. He fired Guy Martin almost immediately afterward, and he didn't hide the reason. He wouldn't be killed riding my motorbike. End of story. It was never about talent. Martin had more of that than anyone on the team. It was about something else. A rider that even the man paying his wages could not control. This was the first time someone with real power over him had to choose. Keep him, or walk away, before his name ended up on the wrong kind of headline. It would not be the last time. The Isle of Man TT is widely considered the most dangerous race on the planet. Public roads, stone walls, no runoff, closing speeds most riders will never see anywhere else in their lives. By 2010, Guy Martin had already spent years chasing something that had somehow never once landed in his hands, an actual win at the Isle of Man TT. At the senior TT that year, he finally had his best shot yet. He was leading the race outright, and to hold that lead, he pushed his bike into Ballygarry Corner at somewhere between 160 and 170 miles an hour, on a public road turned racetrack, with stone walls close enough to touch. Riders on the island have their own nickname for that corner. They call it Balliscary. Martin lost the front end. The bike speared straight into the stone wall lining the course. The fuel tank ruptured on impact, and in an instant, the whole machine turned into a fireball, right there on the racetrack, in full view of the crowd lining the fence. Footage of that fireball has been replayed for years, one of the most watched crashes in the history of the sport. Race officials threw the red flag. It was the first time that had happened at the senior TT in more than 100 years. And somehow, through all of it, Guy Martin never lost consciousness. He climbed away from the wreck with a bruised lung and a small fracture in his spine. Nothing more. A crash that should have ended a career barely slowed him down. But the fire was not the part of that year that hurt him the most. Almost immediately afterward, Simon Buckmaster, the manager of the Parkalgar Honda team, the very team Martin rode for, went public with an attack that had nothing to do with the crash at all. He said Martin had ignored everything the team had agreed on before the race. He said Martin had described a private conversation between the two of them in a way that was, in his own words, the complete opposite of what actually happened. He accused him of using language in interviews that simply was not acceptable, of being rude and disrespectful at press events, of literally eating his lunch while journalists were trying to interview him, and of spending far more energy building his own television image than focusing on the racing itself. This was not some outsider taking a shot from a distance. This was the man who ran his own team, speaking about him in public, on the record. Martin brushed the whole thing off. He dismissed Buckmaster's attack without much of a fight and moved on, the same way he moved on from almost everything. But the pattern was already there for anyone paying attention. The public saw a hero who had just survived a fireball. The people who worked closest to him saw something much harder to forgive. That contradiction, the hero and the man nobody could work with, would follow Guy Martin for the rest of his career on that island. 17 times. That is how many times Guy Martin stood on the podium at the Isle of Man TT. 17 podiums, going all the way back to 2004. And 0 times, not once, did he ever stand on the very top step. For almost 20 years, the man everyone in the paddock feared, the man the fans queued up for hours just to see, could not close out a single TT race win. John McGuinness, the rider who holds the outright lap record on the island, became the measuring stick people used against him. Race after race, year after year, Martin got closer and closer to that number. He was never far away. He was just never quite there. This was not one unlucky rider caught by bad weather or a bad gearbox on the wrong day. This was a pattern, repeated for nearly 2 decades, in front of the entire motorcycling world. And maybe that is exactly the point. Maybe people didn't fear Guy Martin because he was the man who always won. Maybe they feared him for something else entirely, for what he was willing to do just to find out how close to the edge he could get. Winning was never the part that defined him. The 17 podiums prove that. 0 wins prove it even more. In 2017, Guy Martin walked away from the Isle of Man TT for good. When he explained why, he didn't talk about crashes or injuries or even about Simon Buckmaster and everyone else who had turned on him over the years. He compared the whole experience to Groundhog Day. The same race, the same corners, the same story over and over on a loop that never changed. Those are not the words of a bitter man who lost too many times. Winning was never enough to explain why he kept racing in the first place, and it was never enough to explain why he finally stopped, either. Think back to everything you already know about him: a teenager who spent his savings on motorbikes instead of a driving license, a man who leaned on stimulants just to keep working and racing at once, a man chasing 400 miles an hour on a turbine-powered motorbike decades after most riders his age had already slowed down and gone home. An Asperger's diagnosis that didn't change who he was. It only explained him. The obsessions, the tunnel vision, the complete inability to do anything by half measures, including, it turns out, the inability to stop. 17 podiums, 0 wins, 1 fireball, 1 team boss who fired him, 1 team manager who publicly tore him apart in front of the entire sport. None of it made him slow down. Every single piece of it points back to the exact same man. Which brings us back to where we started. April 2026. Guy Martin, now 44 years old, banned from driving for 6 months after being caught speeding twice on a public road. Not on a closed racetrack, Not during a race weekend, just an ordinary road. The same kind of road that led him into that wall at Ballygarry all those years ago. 2 decades, 1 Asperger's diagnosis, 1 fired job, 1 fireball, 1 public attack from his own team manager. 17 podiums and 0 wins later, and the instinct still had not left him. But that same month, something else happened, something that says just as much about who he really is. Guy Martin made his debut in a brand new category of racing. 4 wheels this time instead of 2. The Honda S2000 Cup at Silverstone. He had nothing left to prove there. No championship on the line, no history with the series. Nobody in that paddock was expecting a middle-aged truck mechanic and former TT rider to show up at all. He did it anyway. Because it was something he had never tried before, and for Guy Martin, that alone has always been reason enough. 2 events in the same month, in the same year, pointing at the exact same truth. A speeding ban on public roads, a brand new race series entered for no reason except curiosity. He wasn't done with speed. He had simply found another place to chase it. This is not a story about whether Guy Martin is a good man or a bad one. That was never the point. It is a story about 2 things being true at exactly the same time. On television, in interviews, at meet and greets outside the paddock, millions of people see a working-class hero. A truck mechanic who somehow became one of the most watched riders in motorsport. Funny, honest, impossible not to like. But the people who actually worked closest to him, the ones who had to build a race strategy around him, protect him from himself, answer for him when something went wrong, tell a very different story. Sam Finley, who fired him in 2003. Simon Buckmaster, who tore into him publicly in 2010. They didn't see a hero. They saw a man nobody could control. Both of those things are true. They have always been true. About the exact same person. Guy Martin was never chasing the trophy. He was chasing the thing that happens right before you lose control. 17 podiums. 0 TT wins. And at 44, he's still looking for the next thing that goes too fast.